Did you know that Alduin the World Eater wasn't actually the original villain of Skyrim? Because at first Bethesda wanted it to be Uriel Septim the Fifth, and that's who we are talking about today. First, we are going to talk about something beyond the lore, and look at the actual game development era to see why they decided to scrap the idea of him. Then, we are going to look at his entire lore, and what even brought him into the lands of Skyrim, where he would have ended up becoming a villain. Then we are going to talk about what the events of Skyrim would look like if he was a villain. And lastly, we are going to take a look at some popular theories about him and why he may be appearing in any future games. And yeah, it is quite a lot, so get comfortable whether you are listening to this while falling asleep or just while doing day-to-day tasks. And yeah, let's get into it. So, we need to go back to the early development of Skyrim, somewhere around 2008 or 2009. Todd Howard and the team at Bethesda were mapping out what would become one of the biggest games ever made. They had these notebooks full of ideas, literally handwritten pages where they were figuring out the soul of the game. And in those early drafts, the main villain wasn't Alduin at all. It was going to be Uriel Septim the Fifth, this long-dead emperor from the Third Era who supposedly died in Akavir centuries ago. The pitch was wild. Uriel Septim V would return from the mysterious continent of Akavir, except he wouldn't be coming back as some hero. He'd be leading an army of dragons, and his goal was simple: reclaim Tamriel for the Septim dynasty. Remember, by the time of Skyrim, the Septim line is dead. Martin Septim sacrificed himself at the end of Oblivion, and the empire is falling apart under the Me dynasty. So here comes this legendary warrior emperor from the past, with dragons at his command, ready to take back what he thinks belongs to his bloodline. And this is where it gets really interesting for the lore. Uriel V was a dragonborn himself. That's actually canon in the Elder Scrolls universe. Every Septim emperor had the dragon blood, which is how they could wear the Amulet of Kings and light the dragon fires. So imagine this setup. You're the last dragonborn and you're fighting another dragonborn who has an army of dragons. That's a completely different energy than fighting Alduin, who's basically a god trying to end the world. Todd Howard revealed all this in a 2019 interview at PAX East. He was talking to some people from the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages, and he just casually dropped this bomb about the original Skyrim plot. He said they had this design where Uriel V would return with his army of dragons from Akavir to retake his throne. But then he said something that explains why they scrapped it. Keep the mysterious lands mysterious. Now, some fans have speculated about whether the success of Game of Thrones influenced this decision, but there's no confirmation of that. The Game of Thrones books had been around since the 90s, and the show premiered in 2011, the same year Skyrim released. The concept of undead kings and dragon armies is pretty common in fantasy anyway, going back way further than either Skyrim or Game of Thrones. Both were pulling from the same well of Norse mythology and classic fantasy tropes. But the main reason Todd Howard gave was simple. They wanted to keep Akavir mysterious, and that makes sense from a world-building perspective. There was another practical reason too. Bringing Uriel Septim V back would have required a lot of exposition about Akavir. They'd have to explain this whole mysterious continent, its history, why dragons are there, how Uriel survived, what he's been doing for hundreds of years. That's a lot of world building that could have made the game's opening feel bogged down. Skyrim's opening is already pretty heavy with the Civil War, the Talmor, explaining why dragons are returning. Adding, oh, and by the way, here's everything about Akavir, on top of that might have been too much. Plus, there's the mystery factor. The Elder Scrolls series has always had these far-off legendary places that players speculate about. Akavir is one of them. It's this exotic land to the east where vampire snake people live, where tiger folk are trying to become dragons, where demons freeze every winter. By keeping it mysterious and unexplained, Bethesda preserves this sense of wonder. The moment you show it, the moment you explain it, some of that magic disappears. So they pivoted to Alduin instead, a dragon god from Nordic mythology who wants to eat the world. It's simpler in some ways, more primal. You don't need tons of backstory because Alduin is woven into the existing lore of Skyrim itself. He's part of the Dragon War, part of what makes the Nords who they are. And importantly, he's not human. There's no moral complexity to stopping him. He's a force of nature, apocalypse incarnate. You're not killing someone with a claim to the throne or a tragic backstory. You're stopping the literal end of the world. But here's what's fascinating. Even though they cut Uriel Septim V, they didn't throw away the whole concept. A lot of those ideas ended up getting recycled into the Dragonborn DLC. Miraak, the antagonist of that expansion, is basically what Uriel would have been. He's an ancient Dragonborn who's been trapped in another realm, Apocrypha instead of Akavir. He comes back wanting power, he can control dragons, and you have to fight him as one Dragonborn against another. It's the same core concept, just moved to a DLC and stripped of the political angle about reclaiming the Empire. And you can see other remnants of the original concept throughout the base game. The Blades, for instance. They're all about this Akaviri influence. Skyhaven Temple, where you meet Delphine and Esbern, has Akaviri architecture. There's Alduin's Wall, covered in Akaviri art depicting the prophecy of the Dragonborn. The Blades themselves were founded by Akaviri dragon slayers who came to Tamriel. All of this Akaviri stuff is threaded through Skyrim's main quest, and it makes way more sense when you realize that originally the villain was going to be from Akavir. So that's the development story. They had this ambitious, politically charged villain in Uriel Septim V, leading dragon armies to reclaim his dynasty's throne. But concerns about Akavir staying mysterious, possible similarities to Game of Thrones, and the complexity of the narrative made them pivot to Alduin instead. The Dragonborn versus Dragonborn concept lived on in Miraak, and the Akaviri elements stayed as background flavor. It's one of those fascinating what-if moments in game development where you can see the ghost of what might have been. Now let's actually talk about who Uriel Septim V was, because his story is honestly one of the most interesting in Elder Scrolls lore, and it's completely overshadowed by his more famous descendant, Uriel Septim VII, who you meet at the start of Oblivion. Uriel V became emperor in the year 3 Era 268. That's 3rd Era, for anyone not deep in the lore weeds. He inherited the throne from his father, Seppus Septim II. And from day one, this guy had a completely different vision than the emperors who came before him. Where others focused on holding the empire together, managing internal politics, dealing with the Elder Council, Uriel V looked outward. He wanted conquest. He wanted to expand the empire beyond anything it had ever been. See, the empire at this point was kind of in a rough spot. It wasn't in crisis or anything, but it also wasn't the gleaming powerhouse it had been under Tiber Septim. People were questioning whether the empire still had that strength, that glory. Internal problems were piling up. There's this pattern in Elder Scrolls lore where the empire goes through these cycles of strength and weakness, and Uriel V came into power during one of the weaker periods. His response was basically, "You want to see the empire's strength? I'll show you the empire's strength." And he did it through a series of military campaigns that would define his entire reign. He didn't just talk about restoring glory, he grabbed his armies and started conquering. His first target was Roskria in 3 Era 271. That's an island north of Skyrim, a frozen, harsh place. It took his forces 4 years to conquer it, which should tell you how tough the fighting was. But he did it. Roskria became part of the empire, and Uriel V got his first taste of glory. Then he went after Kathnoki in 3 Era 276. That's another island kingdom, this one to the east, between Tamriel and Akavir. He conquered it. 3 years later, in 3 Era 279, he took Ineslia, yet another island. And in 3 Era 284, he conquered Ezroniet. That's 4 separate island kingdoms in just over a decade. This guy was on a roll. But here's the thing about Uriel V that makes him fascinating. He wasn't just some warmonger. According to the histories, he was genuinely seen as a great ruler by many people. He had the military genius thing down, obviously, but he also understood logistics, planning, patience. He spent years building up naval forces, establishing supply chains, training troops, When he invaded somewhere, it wasn't some reckless charge. He had everything mapped out. The accounts describe him as charismatic too, the kind of leader soldiers would follow into hell. And he needed that quality, because these island conquests weren't easy. Each one required crossing dangerous waters, landing on hostile shores, fighting in unfamiliar terrain against determined defenders. His troops had to trust him completely to keep doing this campaign after campaign. Back home in Cyrodiil, though, things were interesting, because while Uriel V was off conquering, somebody had to actually run the empire day to day. That fell to the Elder Council. They basically had free reign while he was gone, which is probably part of why they let him keep doing his conquest thing. He was giving them all the real power at home while he chased glory abroad. And people loved him for it. Or at least, a lot of people did. When you're winning battles and expanding the empire, when you're bringing back loot and new territories, when your soldiers are coming home with stories of victory, public opinion tends to be pretty favorable. Uriel V understood propaganda, understood spectacle. Every conquest reinforced this image of the empire as strong, unstoppable, glorious again. The nobility ate it up. Imperial citizens ate it up. Here was an emperor who wasn't content to just manage decline. He was actively building something, expanding, conquering. It felt like the days of Tiber Septim again. There were victory parades, monuments erected, poems and songs written about his campaigns. His legend was growing with every island he added to the empire. But underneath all that glory-seeking, there were practical considerations too. Each island he conquered wasn't just about pride. These places had resources, strategic value. Roskria, despite being frozen and harsh, had mineral deposits and access to northern trade routes. Kathnaqui and Waineslia controlled shipping lanes between Tamriel and the eastern waters. Ezroniet had fertile lands and a skilled population that could be integrated into the empire. So Uriel wasn't just randomly picking fights. He was systematically securing the empire's maritime borders, controlling key strategic points, building up the infrastructure for something bigger. Every conquest was a stepping stone. And if you look at the pattern, they all pointed in one direction, east, toward Akavir. See, Akavir had been this obsession for Tamrielic rulers for a long time. Way back in the First Era, the Tsaeshi from Akavir invaded Tamriel. They got as far as conquering parts of what's now Cyrodiil before the Dragonborn Emperor Riman stopped them. But some Tsaeshi stayed integrated into Tamrielic society, and they brought knowledge of Akavir with them. Knowledge of a vast continent with ancient civilizations, mysterious races, and most importantly for our story, dragons. The Tsaeshi had this whole culture around dragons. They called themselves dragon eaters or dragon killers, depending on how you translate it. Their martial arts, their swordsmanship, their entire philosophy was built around the concept of defeating and consuming dragons to gain their power. Whether this was literal or metaphorical, the point is that Akavir had a living dragon culture when Tamriel's dragons were mostly extinct or in hiding. For a dragonborn emperor like Uriel V, that had to be tantalizing. Here he was, with the blood of dragons running through his veins, with the Thu'um potentially at his command, and there was a whole continent out there where dragons still existed, where he could prove himself against the ultimate challenge, where he could become not just a great emperor, but a legend on par with the ancient dragonborn heroes. Plus, there was the practical angle. If he could conquer Akavir, if he could bring that entire massive continent under imperial control, he wouldn't just be a great emperor. He'd be the emperor, the one who accomplished what no one else ever had. Not even Tiber Septim had conquered Akavir. Riman had only repelled an Akaviri invasion, he never went there himself. Uriel V saw an opportunity to surpass both of them. So after conquering Ezroniet in 3 Era 284, he immediately started renovating the port at Black Harbor. This would be his launching point, the last piece of Tamriel his forces would see before heading into the unknown. He commissioned massive shipbuilding programs because the Imperial Navy didn't have enough ocean-going vessels for what he was planning. We're talking about a fleet that could carry 4 full legions, thousands of colonists, supplies for years, siege equipment, everything needed to establish a permanent imperial presence on another continent. The logistics alone were staggering. Ships had to be designed that could handle the rough waters of the Potomac Ocean. Supply chains had to be established to keep the fleet maintained and provisioned. Officers had to be trained in naval warfare, because most imperial soldiers were used to fighting on land. This wasn't something Uriel could do in a year or two. It took time, but he was patient when he needed to be. He spent years on the preparation, because he knew this invasion had to succeed. There would be no second chance. The journey to Akavir was so long and dangerous that mounting another expedition would be nearly impossible if the first one failed. During this preparation period, Uriel was also consolidating his earlier conquests. Roskria, Kathnaqui, Ineslea, and Esroniet all needed to be properly integrated into the empire. Governors had to be appointed, garrisons established, trade organized. These islands would serve as stepping stones and supply points for the Akavir expedition. Ships could stop at them to resupply on the way, and if things went wrong, they'd be fallback positions. The Elder Council back in Cyrodiil was getting nervous though. They'd been happy to let Uriel conquer some islands, but Akavir was different. The distance alone was terrifying. The Potomac Ocean was known for its storms, its sea monsters, its unpredictable currents. Ships that ventured too far east often never came back, and Akavir itself was legendary for its dangers. Every account from the few people who'd been there and returned spoke of a land completely alien to Tamriel, where the normal rules didn't apply. But Uriel was the emperor. He had the support of the military, the support of the common people who loved his victories, and the backing of enough nobles who saw opportunity in new conquests. The Elder Council could voice concerns, but they couldn't stop him. And honestly, part of them probably hoped he'd succeed. Imagine if he actually conquered Akavir. The empire would double in size overnight. The wealth and prestige would be enormous. So in 3E 288, the expedition finally launched. It was huge. The exact numbers vary depending on which source you read, but we're talking about 4 full legions of the Imperial Army. That's potentially 40,000 soldiers, though legions in the Third Era might have been smaller than the classical 10,000 men. Plus thousands more support personnel, colonists, craftsmen, mages, healers. Everyone needed to establish a functioning colony. The Far East Fleet, as it was called, consisted of hundreds of ships, troop transports, supply vessels, warships for protection, specialized ships carrying siege equipment, and war machines. It was the largest naval expedition in Tamriel's history, larger even than Tiber Septim's fleet when he conquered Somerset Isle. The journey took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sailing across open ocean, watching the horizon, dealing with storms and rough seas. The fleet stayed together remarkably well considering the challenges. Ships were lost, certainly, but the vast majority made it. And finally, after a month and a half at sea, they sighted land. Akavir. The landing site was a small Taishi port town at the mouth of a big river. The scouts had chosen it because it provided access to the interior via the river and because the town itself could serve as an initial base. But when the Imperial forces landed, they found the town completely abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned, just empty. The Tsaiski had pulled back, leaving their homes and belongings behind. This should have been the first warning sign, but at the time it seemed like good fortune. The Imperials took over the town without firing a shot. They renamed it Septimia in honor of the Emperor and his dynasty, and immediately began expanding it. Engineers went to work fortifying the defenses, expanding the docks to handle the massive fleet, setting up warehouses for supplies. While this was happening, Uriel V didn't sit around waiting. He took 2 of his 4 legions and marched inland, following the river north. He left the other 2 legions to garrison Septimia and protect the fleet. This was textbook military strategy. Secure your landing zone, establish a base, then push forward to take more territory. About 100 miles up the river, they found another city. This one was larger than Septimia, more developed with better infrastructure. and like Septimia, it was completely abandoned. The Tsaisky had pulled back again, leaving everything behind. Uriel claimed the city, renamed it Ionith after one of his ancestors, and declared it the new capital of the imperial province of Akavir. Think about that for a second. He'd been on Akavir for maybe a couple weeks, and he was already declaring it an imperial province, naming cities, establishing a capital. The confidence, or maybe arrogance, was incredible. But from his perspective, everything was going perfectly. 2 major cities taken without a fight, rich farmland in between them, a secure supply line via the river back to the fleet. The land around Ionith was described in the surviving accounts as beautiful. Fertile fields stretching for miles, orchards full of strange fruits, forests with timber for building. It looked like a paradise compared to some of the harsh places the imperial legions had fought before. The soldiers who'd been expecting a frozen wasteland or a demon-infested nightmare were pleasantly surprised. Colonists started arriving from the ships. They moved into the abandoned Tsaishi homes, started working the fields, setting up shops and services. Engineers began expanding Ionith's infrastructure to handle the growing population. Mages set up wards and defensive enchantments. Everything that goes into establishing a new colony was happening at an impressive pace. Winter came, and this was actually seen as good news. Winter in Akavir meant the Kamal demons would freeze solid in their homeland to the north. The Tangmo monkey folk would be stuck on their islands. The Kapotun tiger folk were far to the south. The only real threat was the Tsaisky, and they'd been avoiding contact. Some scouts had spotted Tsaishi watching from a distance, but there were no attacks, no ambushes, nothing. Then Tsaishi emissaries showed up. They came to Ionith under a flag of peace and requested an audience with the emperor. This seemed like a breakthrough. Maybe the Tsaishi recognized that fighting was pointless and were ready to accept imperial rule. Maybe they wanted to negotiate terms of submission. Maybe they were even willing to become part of the empire peacefully. The negotiations went on for weeks. The Tsaisky were described as unsettling to look at, with their snake-like features and unblinking eyes. But they were diplomatic and sophisticated. They spoke of peace, of mutual benefit, of trade and cultural exchange. They asked questions about the empire, about Cyrodiil, about why Uriel had come to Akavir. And all the while, they were studying the imperial forces, learning their tactics, their numbers, their supply lines, their weaknesses, because this was all a trap. The abandoned cities, the empty countryside, the peaceful negotiations, all of it was the Tsaisky buying time and gathering intelligence. See, the Tsaishi are described in the lore as ancient, patient, and cunning. They'd fought wars for thousands of years. They knew that rushing in against an unknown enemy was foolish. Better to let the enemy think they'd won, let them get comfortable, let them spread out and weaken their positions, than strike when they're vulnerable. The winter storms that year were brutal, supernaturally brutal. Some of the surviving accounts suggest that Tsaisky had weather magic or had called in favors from Akaviri spirits or dragons. The storms came out of nowhere, massive and relentless. Ships trying to sail from Tamriel to Septimia were battered, delayed, or sunk. The supply line that was supposed to keep the invasion force fed and equipped started breaking down. The river between Septimia and Ionith dried up despite it being winter, supposedly the rainy season. Suddenly, the main supply route between the capital and the port was gone. Ships couldn't navigate the river, and the road along the riverbank became the only way to move supplies. That road was vulnerable to raiders, to ambushes, to all sorts of problems. And then the Tsaishi stopped negotiating. They stopped pretending. They attacked everywhere at once. The forces in Ionith found themselves surrounded by Tsaishi armies that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The garrison in Septimia came under siege. The road between the two cities was cut off. Small outposts and farming communities were overrun in days. The imperial legions fought back, obviously. These were elite soldiers, well-trained and well-equipped. But they were fighting in unfamiliar territory against an enemy that knew the land perfectly. The Tsaishi used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, poisoned water supplies, spread disease through the camps. They weren't facing the Imperials in open battle where the Legion's discipline and formation fighting would dominate. They were making it a war of attrition. Uriel V found himself trapped in Ionith with 2 legions, cut off from the other 2 legions in Septimia, with supplies running dangerously low. The colonists who'd been so optimistic a few months ago were now hiding behind the city walls, terrified. The dream of conquering Akavir was turning into a nightmare of survival. In the summer of 3 Era 289, Uriel tried one last offensive. Intelligence reports said a major Tsaeski army was gathering in the mountains to the north. If he could defeat that army, capture or kill its commanders, maybe he could turn the tide. Maybe the Tsaishi would lose heart and sue for peace. So he marched north with the best troops he had left. They climbed into the mountains, found the Tsaishi army, and attacked. And against all odds, they won. The Tsaishi were defeated, scattered. Uriel's forces even captured some of the Tsaeski commanders. It should have been a turning point, a glorious victory that changed everything. But the retreat back to Ionith was a disaster. The Tsaeski had been waiting for this. They'd let Uriel march his army into the mountains, let him win his battle, and then they hit the exhausted, overextended Imperial forces on the way back. The march became a running fight through mountain passes, with Tsaishi ambushing from every direction. By the time they got back to Ionith, Uriel's legions had taken massive casualties. The victory meant nothing, and now both Ionith and Septimia were under full siege. The Tsaeski weren't interested in negotiations anymore. They wanted the invaders gone, and they were willing to starve them out or slaughter them, whichever came first. The fleet back in Septimia was trying desperately to break through and evacuate the garrisons, but the storms continued, and the Tsaishi had their own ships harassing the Imperials. Communication between Ionith and Septimia broke down almost entirely. Runners trying to get messages through the Tsaeski lines were caught and killed. Mages trying to send magical communications found their spells blocked or intercepted. Finally, in early winter of 3 Era 290, the Far East Fleet managed to fight through the storms and reach Septimia. The decision was made to evacuate. The garrison there could get on the ships and escape. But Ionith was 100 miles inland. The fleet couldn't reach them. They were on their own. The last confirmed communication from Uriel Septim V came in early frostfall, the 10th month of the year. It was a brief magical sending to the fleet commanders in Septimia. They were breaking out, marching for the coast, would link up with the evacuation. After that, silence. What we know about the end comes from the survivors who made it to Septimia. The breakout happened at night. The 10th and 14th legions, what was left of them after months of siege and starvation, burst through the Tsaeshi siege lines. The plan was for the 14th to move fast, get to Septimia while they had the element of surprise. The 10th would follow behind, slower, covering the retreat and protecting the wounded and civilians. The 14th made it, or at least part of it did. They crashed into Septimia battered and bloody, having fought their way through Tsaishi positions for 100 miles. But the 10th Legion never arrived. Neither did Emperor Uriel Septim V. According to the survivors of the 14th, the 10th got surrounded on the road about halfway to Septimia. The Tsaeski had been tracking them, letting them exhaust themselves with the march, and then they struck in overwhelming numbers. The 10th formed a shield wall, tried to hold the road long enough for the rear elements to escape. Uriel Septim V was seen fighting with his men, the emperor wielding a sword, rallying his soldiers, trying to hold the line. That's how the survivors describe him in his final moments, standing with the 10th, organizing their shield wall, shouting orders and encouragement. He wasn't hiding in the center of the formation or trying to escape. He was on the front line doing what he'd always done, leading from the front. The Tsaishi hit them with arrows, thousands of arrows, wave after wave. The survivors said the sky turned black with them, and somewhere in that storm of arrows, Uriel Septim V fell. Some accounts say he was hit multiple times but kept fighting until he collapsed. Others say a Tsaeshi champion killed him in single combat after the shield wall broke. The truth is lost in the chaos of battle. What's certain is that he died there on that road in Akavir, thousands of miles from home, with his legion dying around him. One of the greatest military emperors in Tamrielic history, cut down in a failed invasion. The 10th Legion was annihilated. Maybe a handful escaped, but as a fighting force, it ceased to exist that day. The survivors in Septimia got on the ships and ran. The Far East fleet, what was left of it, sailed back across the Padomaic Ocean carrying the broken remnants of 4 legions. Thousands dead, the Emperor dead, years of preparation and massive resources completely wasted. When they arrived back in Tamriel, they brought the news that the invasion had been a complete disaster. Back in Cyrodiil, Uriel, the 5th son, also named Uriel, was crowned emperor. He was 5 years old. The boy emperor Uriel Septim VI would rule under a regency for years, with the Elder Council having even more power than before. The empire would never try to invade Akavir again. The whole thing became known as the disaster at Ionith, and it's remembered as one of the worst military failures in imperial history. But here's where it gets interesting for our story. Uriel Septim V's body was never recovered. The survivors who saw him fall didn't have time to retrieve his corpse. They were running for their lives. The Tsaeshi controlled the battlefield. So, officially, yes, the emperor died at Ionith, but there's no tomb, no funeral, no physical proof. Just testimony from traumatized survivors of a chaotic battle. And in the lore, in the histories, there are these weird little hints that maybe not everyone believes he actually died. There are references to expeditions sent to Akavir years later trying to find out what happened to him. There are mentions of rumors that he survived and was taken prisoner by the Tseski. Nothing concrete, just these little threads that suggest the door was always open for him to somehow return. That's what makes him perfect for a villain return story. He's this legendary warrior, emperor, dragonborn, military genius who disappeared in the most mysterious place in the Elder Scrolls universe. The official story is that he died, but there's enough ambiguity that you could easily write a story where he survived, where the Tsaeshi captured him instead of killing him, where he made some kind of deal to survive, where he spent centuries in Akavir being transformed into something else. And that's where we get to imagine what would have happened if Bethesda had stuck with their original plan for Skyrim, because in that version, Uriel V wouldn't have died at Ionith. Or if he did, he wouldn't have stayed dead. Somehow, in some way, he would have returned. And when he came back, he would have had dragons with him and vengeance on his mind. So let's get into the really fun stuff now. What would Skyrim actually look like if Uriel Septim V was the villain instead of Alduin? Because this changes pretty much everything about the game's story, themes, and even gameplay. First off, the whole opening would be different. In the actual game, you're being carted off to your execution in Helgen, and then boom, Alduin shows up and starts wrecking everything. Random dragon attack, chaos, you escape. It establishes dragons as the threat, sets up the apocalyptic vibe. With Uriel V as the villain, you'd probably still have something dramatic at the start, but it would need to set up a different kind of threat. Maybe instead of a random dragon attack, you're in Helgen when scouts bring news that an Akaviri fleet has been spotted off the northern coast. Or maybe the opening shows a dragon attack, but the dragon has a rider, someone commanding it. The dragon isn't just mindless destruction, it's a weapon being wielded. That would immediately tell players, this is different, this is organized, this is an invasion, not just monsters showing up. You could even have a really cool opening where you actually see Uriel Septim V. Maybe the dragon that attacks Helgen lands, and you get a glimpse of this armored figure sitting on its back. He could speak, issue a proclamation, something like, I am Uriel Septim V, rightful Emperor of Tamriel. I have returned from the east to reclaim my throne. Those who submit will be spared. Those who resist will burn. Then he flies off and the dragon starts wrecking things. That would be an incredible hook. The civil war between the Imperials and Stormcloaks would hit completely different too. In the actual game, the Civil War is important, but it's kind of running parallel to the Dragon Crisis. You can even ignore it, for the most part, and just focus on Alduin. But if Uriel V is coming back to reclaim the Empire for the Septim Dynasty, suddenly the Civil War is directly connected to the main plot. Think about the dynamics. General Tullius and the Imperial Legion are fighting for the Mede Dynasty. They are loyal to Emperor Titus Mede II, who's ruling from the White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil. From their perspective, Uriel Septim V would be an impostor at best, a monster at worst. This thing claiming to be a long-dead emperor, leading dragon armies, it's an abomination. They'd have to fight him even though he's technically a Septim, the bloodline they claim to honor. But the Stormcloaks, man, that's where it gets really interesting. Ulfric and his followers are all about Nordic independence, about Skyrim for the Nords, about rejecting the current empire because it's weak and has betrayed Nordic traditions. But Ulfric also talks constantly about respecting the old ways, the ancient traditions, and Uriel Septim V was a dragonborn emperor. By Nordic tradition, by the ancient customs Ulfric claims to value, dragonborn are basically sacred. The old Nordic kingdoms followed dragonborn rulers. The greatest heroes of Nordic legend were dragonborn. So, would the Stormcloaks side with Uriel against the Mede Dynasty? Would some of them see him as the rightful ruler they should be following instead of fighting for independence? Would Ulfric himself be torn between his hatred of the Empire and his respect for the Dragonborn legacy? You could have this split happen right in the game. Imagine a quest where Ulfric calls a mood of the Stormcloak Jarls to discuss this Uriel situation. Some Jarls argue they should ally with him because he's Dragonborn and represents the old Empire they actually respected, not the Mede weaklings. Other Jarls argue he's been gone for 400 years, he's clearly been corrupted by whatever kept him alive, and he has no right to Skyrim. Ulfric is stuck in the middle, trying to hold his rebellion together, while it threatens to split over this exact question. And imagine if some Stormcloak holds actually do side with Uriel. Suddenly you're not dealing with a two-way civil war anymore. You've got the Imperial Legion loyal to the Medes, holding some holds, the Stormcloaks under Ulfric holding other holds, and then some holds that have declared for Uriel Septim V and are flying Septim banners. The whole map becomes this complicated mess of shifting allegiances. The player would have to navigate that. Maybe you can try to unite the factions against Uriel, convincing them that whatever his claim to the throne, he's too dangerous to be allowed to win. Or maybe you can play them against each other, weakening all three sides. Or maybe you actually choose to join Uriel, believing his claim is legitimate and he's the rightful emperor. That would be a wild option, fighting against both the Medes and the Stormcloaks for the restoration of the Septim line. The blades would be completely different in this version. In the actual game, Delphine and Isburn are basically the Lost Blades, and they're focused on killing Paarthurnax because dragons are evil and can be trusted, end of story. But the Blades were originally servants of the Septim Emperors. They were the Dragon Guard who came from Akavir way back in the day, and they swore themselves to protecting the Dragonborn Emperor. That was their entire purpose for existing. So, what happens when a Septim Dragonborn comes back from Akavir, the very place the Blades' ancestors came from? This would tear the Blades' philosophy apart. Delphine might argue that Uriel V is a corrupted mockery of what he once was, that whatever he is now, he's not truly the emperor they should serve, that serving him would betray everything the Blades actually stand for. But you could also have other characters, maybe former Blades or Blade sympathizers, who completely disagree, who think that the Blade's sacred duty is to the Septim line above all else, that if a Septim Dragonborn has returned, then their obligation is clear: serve him. This could lead to a whole questline about tracking down former Blades agents who've come out of hiding to join Uriel, and you have to decide whether to stop them or join them. Imagine finding old Blades agents living under assumed names throughout Skyrim. When word spreads that a Septim has returned, they start revealing themselves, dusting off their old Akaviri swords, putting on their armor. Some are going to Uriel to offer their service. And Delphine is trying to stop them because she believes they're making a terrible mistake, but they believe she's the one who's forgotten her duty. The conversations between Delphine and these returning blades could be amazing character moments. Arguments about what loyalty means, what happens when your sacred duty conflicts with what you believe is right, whether traditions and oaths matter more than present reality. These are the kinds of moral questions that would make the story so much richer than just kill the world-eating dragon. Esbern would probably be torn too. He's a lore master. He knows the history better than anyone. He knows that Uriel V was a great emperor, that the Septim line was sacred, that the blades exist because of their oath to that bloodline. But he also knows about the disaster at Ionith, knows that Uriel disappeared in Akavir 400 years ago, knows that whatever came back probably isn't the same man who left. You could have scenes where Esbern is poring over his books and scrolls, trying to find some precedent for this situation, some guidance from Blade's history about what to do when a long-dead emperor returns. And he's finding conflicting accounts, different interpretations, nothing that gives a clear answer. The man who's supposed to have all the knowledge doesn't know what's right anymore. Parthurnax and the Greybeards would have fascinating reactions to all this. Parthurnax helped humans overthrow Alduin's dragon cult way back in the ancient Dragon War. He turned against his own brother, against his own kind, because he believed dragons had become tyrants and oppressors. He spent thousands of years meditating on the nature of power, teaching the way of the voice to the Greybeards, trying to understand how to have power without being corrupted by it. So what does Parthurnax think when a Dragonborn comes back from Akavir commanding dragons? When someone is using the Tu'um and dragon allies to conquer Skyrim? This is exactly the kind of situation Parthurnax has been philosophizing about for millennia. Does he see Uriel as another tyrant who needs to be stopped? Or does he see a kindred spirit, another being trying to find balance between power and wisdom? The conversations you'd have with Parthurnax would be so much deeper than they are in the base game. Instead of him just teaching you shouts and talking about abstract philosophy, he'd be directly engaging with the main conflict. He might try to contact Uriel, dragon to dragonborn, and reason with him. He might share stories about his own struggles with the temptation of domination, trying to warn you about the path Uriel is walking. And Parthurnax would be worried about you too, because you're also dragonborn, you're also growing in power, learning shouts, commanding respect through your dragon blood. The more you fight Uriel, the more you become like him. The more dragons you kill and absorb, the more of their power flows into you. Parthurnax would be watching you closely, wondering if you'll repeat history, if you'll become what you're fighting against. The Greybeards themselves would be divided. They're all about restraint, about the way of the voice being used only for worship and meditation, never for violence except in the most dire circumstances. But this is a dragonborn emperor commanding dragons to conquer Skyrim. Is that dire enough to break their vows? Some Greybeards might say yes, they need to help stop this threat. Others might say no. Getting involved in politics and war is exactly what they've sworn not to do. You could even have one of the Greybeards leave High Hrothgar to join either your side or Uriel's side, breaking his vows because he believes the situation demands it. That would be a huge moment, seeing these monks who've held to their principles for lifetimes making the choice to abandon them because something bigger is at stake. The main quest structure would probably follow a very different path. Instead of learning about Alduin's return, racing to learn the Dragonrend shout, and fighting Alduin in Sovngarde, you'd be learning about Uriel's history, figuring out how he survived or was resurrected, and finding a way to counter his power. The whole middle section of the game could be about investigating what happened at Ionith. You'd need to find survivors or their descendants, people who have records, journals, anything that explains what really happened on that battlefield 400 years ago. Maybe there are former Imperial soldiers who settled in Skyrim after returning from the disaster, and their families still have their campaign journals. Imagine a quest where you track down an elderly woman in some small village, and she shows you her great-great-grandfather's journal from the Akavir campaign. You sit down and read it, And the game does this cool transition where you're reading his words while seeing flashbacks of the invasion. You see the landing at Septimia, the march to Ionith, the initial optimism, the slow realization that something's wrong, the siege, the desperation, the breakout. And then you get to the entry about the final battle on the road. The writer describes seeing Emperor Uriel fighting on the front line, describes the arrow storm, describes the Emperor going down. But then there's this detail that's weird. The writer says he saw Tsaisi warriors dragging something away from where the Emperor fell. Not leaving his body on the field like they did with other casualties, but specifically retrieving something, maybe retrieving someone. That would be your first hint that Uriel might not have died, that the Tsaisi might have captured him alive. And then you'd need to find out why. What would the Tsaisi want with a captured Dragonborn Emperor? What could they do with him? What could they offer him that would make him join them instead of staying loyal to Tamriel? You might travel to Akaviri ruins in Tamriel. There are Akaviri settlements scattered around, places where refugees and traders established themselves over the centuries. Skyhaven Temple is one, but there would be others. These places might have records, artifacts, cultural knowledge that gives you insight into Tsaisi thinking. You'd learn about their beliefs, their magic, their relationship with dragons. And here's where you discover something crucial. The Tsaisi are obsessed with immortality. That's part of their lore. They're described as vampiric, as having extended lifespans or maybe being truly immortal. They might have offered Uriel something he couldn't refuse when he was dying on that battlefield. A chance to survive, to continue living, to eventually return and complete his conquest. But immortality always comes with a price. Maybe the Tseshi transformed him into something like them, something vampiric or serpentine. Maybe they bound his will to theirs for a time, making him serve them. Maybe they put him into some kind of stasis or imprisonment, keeping him alive but locked away. The details would depend on how Bethesda wanted to portray him, but the core concept is that his survival cost him something vital. His humanity, his free will, his connection to what he used to be. You might use an Elder Scroll to view the past directly, like how the Time Wound quest works in the actual game. Maybe there's an Elder Scroll specifically about the disaster at Ionith, hidden away in some forgotten library or Dwemer ruin. You'd read it and experience the battle firsthand, seeing through the eyes of someone who was there. And at the climax, you'd see what really happened to Uriel. Maybe you see him falling under the arrows, bleeding out, his legionaries dying around him. And then Tsaisi sorcerers approaching, chanting in their strange language, working some kind of ritual. They're not finishing him off. They're preserving him, transforming him, pulling his soul out and putting it into something else. A phylactery maybe, like a lich. Or binding it to a dragon, creating some kind of hybrid consciousness. The exact mechanism matters less than the horror of what's being done to him. And maybe, in that vision, you see Uriel's perspective. Feel his rage and desperation as he realizes he's failed. Feel his fear as the Tsaisi magic takes hold. Feel his consciousness fragmenting as he's transformed into something other than human that would make him tragic in a way Alduin never was. Alduin is a force of nature doing what he was always meant to do. Uriel was a man who reached too far and paid a terrible price. Coming out of that Elder Scroll vision, you'd know what you're really dealing with. Not just an emperor who came back, but an emperor who was broken and remade, who's been stewing in whatever the Tsaisi did to him for 4 centuries, who's built up dragons and armies and plans for revenge. He's not just claiming his throne. He's trying to prove that his sacrifice meant something, that his failure wasn't the end, that he can still be the conqueror he always believed he was. This makes the conflict way more personal and tragic than fighting Alduin. You can't reason with the apocalypse, but you might be able to reason with Uriel, or at least understand him. Even if you have to stop him, you can recognize that he was a victim before he became a monster. That makes the story hurt in a good way. The dragons themselves would function completely differently. In base Skyrim, dragons are basically wild forces of nature awakened by Alduin. They're aggressive and territorial, attacking humans because that's what dragons do. Some of them want to serve Alduin, some of them are more independent, but they're all operating on dragon logic that's alien to human thinking. But with Uriel commanding them, dragons would have a purpose beyond just their nature. They'd be soldiers in an invasion force, weapons wielded by a strategic mind. You'd see dragons specifically targeting military installations, burning supply caravans, destroying fortifications that could be used against Uriel's armies. Every dragon encounter would feel like it's part of a larger campaign instead of just a random monster fight. The dragons might even talk to you more. They try to intimidate you, tell you that the Dragonborn Emperor is coming and resistance is futile. They'd offer you chances to surrender and serve. Some of them might even respect you as a fellow Dragonborn's worthy opponent, giving you this weird chivalric vibe where they acknowledge you're strong but insist you're on the wrong side. Imagine fighting a dragon, and after you damage it enough, instead of just continuing to fight to the death, it lands and speaks. It tells you that Emperor Uriel recognizes your strength, that he would accept you as an ally, that as a fellow Dragonborn you should be fighting together to restore the Septim Dynasty. And you'd have dialogue options about whether to consider that offer, tell the dragon to take a message back to Uriel, or just attack and finish it off. That would make dragon fights way more interesting from a narrative perspective. They're not just combat encounters. They're story moments, opportunities for the game to develop Uriel's character and motivations through his dragon servants. The soul-absorbing mechanic would take on new meaning too. Every dragon you kill and absorb is one less weapon in Uriel's arsenal. You're directly weakening his invasion force, cutting down his options. And he'd notice. Maybe after you've killed enough dragons, Uriel himself sends you a message through some magical means. He acknowledges that you're costing him valuable allies, expresses frustration or even respect, warns you that eventually you'll face him directly. And here's a scary thought. If Uriel is Dragonborn, he can absorb dragon souls too. So there's potentially a race happening. Both you and Uriel are killing dragons and gaining their power. Every dragon that dies empowers one of you. Maybe the game tracks this, and if you don't kill dragons fast enough, Uriel grows too powerful. Or maybe there are specific legendary dragons that both you and Uriel want, and you have to get to them first. Imagine a quest where you learn that Uriel is planning to kill and absorb Paarthurnax. Because Paarthurnax is ancient and powerful, and absorbing him would give Uriel a massive boost. So you have to race to High Hrothgar to protect Paarthurnax, and you might arrive just as Uriel himself is there fighting the old dragon. That would be intense. The actual structure of the main quest would need to build toward a confrontation with Uriel himself. In the base game, you fight Alduin twice, once at the Throat of the World, where Paarthurnax helps you, and once in Sovngarde, where you have the heroes of old helping. With Uriel, the fights would probably be more personal and grounded. Maybe the first confrontation happens midway through the game. You've been disrupting his invasion, killing his dragons, foiling his plans, so he decides to deal with you personally. He flies to Whiterun or Solitude or wherever you are, challenges you directly. This wouldn't be a fight to the death yet. It would be him sizing you up, testing your strength, seeing if you're worthy of being called Dragonborn. The fight would be brutal. Uriel would use Tuum against you, proper shouts that he's mastered over centuries of practice. He'd fight with weapons, not just rely on magic. He might even shift between human form and some kind of dragon form if the Tsaeshi transformations gave him that ability. And after you've fought for a while, maybe bloodied each other, he'd disengage. Tell you that you've proven yourself a worthy opponent, that the next time you meet one of you will die, and then he flies off on his dragon mount. That encounter would establish him as a real threat, not some distant villain you only hear about. He's right there, fighting you, and you realize he's probably stronger than you are right now. You need to grow more powerful, learn more shouts, gather more allies if you're going to defeat him. The political side of the main quest would involve trying to unite Skyrim against Uriel. This means dealing with the civil war in a meaningful way. You can't just ignore it like you can in the base game. The Imperials and Stormcloaks need to stop fighting each other and focus on the real threat, or at least agree to a truce long enough to deal with Uriel's invasion. This could lead to an amazing sequence where you broker a peace conference. All the major leaders come to High Hrothgar or some neutral ground. General Tullius, representing the Mede dynasty, Ulfric representing the Stormcloaks, maybe even Jarls, who've declared for Uriel, sending representatives. And you have to navigate this political nightmare, convince people who hate each other to work together, make compromises that nobody likes but everyone can accept. The Greybeards would host the conference since they're neutral. Paarthurnax might even attend, this ancient dragon trying to broker peace between humans so they can face a greater threat. And the whole time there's this tension because Uriel could attack at any moment. His forces are out there, his dragons are circling. Everyone at this conference knows they're vulnerable, which puts pressure on them to actually reach an agreement. Different choices you made earlier in the game would affect this conference. If you sided with the Imperials or Stormcloaks in the Civil War, that faction trusts you more, but the other side is skeptical. If you stayed neutral, you might have more credibility as a mediator. If you killed Paarthurnax like Delphine wanted, the Greybeards might refuse to help. All your choices would matter in this moment. Assuming you managed to forge some kind of alliance, the final act would be preparing for the ultimate confrontation with Uriel. You'd need to gather armies, position forces, maybe learn a special shout, or find a legendary weapon that can counter Uriel's power. The blades would help if you kept them on your side. The Greybeards might teach you an ancient form of Thu'um that's been forbidden. You'd call in every favor, every ally you've made throughout your adventures. The location for the final battle needs to be thematically appropriate. In the base game, you fight Alduin in Sovngarde because he's a Nordic apocalypse figure and Sovngarde is the Nordic afterlife. It's mythologically perfect. But where do you fight Uriel Septim V? One option is the Throat of the World. It's the highest point in Skyrim, the most sacred place to the Nords, where the ancient Dragonborn heroes learned the Way of the Voice. Having two Dragonborn fight there would be symbolically powerful. The mountain where humans learn to speak like dragons becomes the site where two dragon-blooded emperors destroy each other. Another option is taking the fight to Cyrodiil. Maybe Uriel has captured the White Gold Tower by this point, declared himself emperor from the Ruby Throne. You'd have to lead an assault on the Imperial City itself, fighting through his forces, climbing the White Gold Tower. The final confrontation happens in the throne room, where emperors have been crowned for thousands of years. You're fighting him in the heart of the empire he claims to rule. That would require the game to actually show you Cyrodiil, which might have been technically difficult, but imagine how epic it would be. You and your allies marching on the Imperial City, seeing it besieged, fighting through streets you maybe remember from Oblivion, watching dragons strafe the walls. It would feel like the stakes are way bigger than Skyrim alone. The fate of the entire empire is being decided. Or maybe the fight happens in some mystical location connected to Akavir. Like there's a portal or a realm where Akavir's influence bleeds into Tamriel, and Uriel draws his power from that connection. You'd have to enter this alien place, fight him surrounded by Tseshi architecture and Akaviri magic, cutting him off from the source of his immortality. The fight itself needs to be spectacular. Uriel would use every tool at his disposal. Summoning dragons mid-fight, using shouts you haven't even learned yet, wielding legendary Septim artifacts like Tiber Septim's own blade. Maybe he has multiple phases where he transforms, showing more and more of what the Tseshi did to him. His human form gives way to something monstrous, something that's been kept alive through dark magic for 4 centuries. And here's where player choice could really shine. Maybe you don't have to kill him, maybe midway through the fight you can talk to him. Use your Thu'um to break through whatever's controlling him, reach the part of him that's still the man who was once a great emperor. And he realizes what he's become, what he's been doing. The horror of 400 years of corruption finally breaks through. If you go that route, Uriel might choose to end it himself. Like a tragic hero realizing he's become the villain, he removes whatever's keeping him alive and dies for real this time. You've given him a chance to die with dignity instead of as a monster. That would be way more emotionally satisfying than just beating him in combat. Or maybe you can't reach him. Maybe he's too far gone, too consumed by his obsession with conquest and revenge. In that case, you fight him to the death. And when you strike the killing blow, when you absorb his dragon soul, you'd get this massive power surge. All the strength he accumulated over centuries flows into you. You'd become incredibly powerful, maybe even too powerful. And that's where Paarthurnax's warnings would come full circle. Because now you're the most powerful dragonborn in the world. You have armies loyal to you. You've proven you can unite Skyrim. Some people might even want you to take the throne yourself, become emperor. The temptation would be real. Do you follow Uriel's path, believing you could do it better? Or do you resist, prove that you're different, that power doesn't have to corrupt? The ending would depend on choices you made throughout the game. If you claimed too much power, killed Paarthurnax, chose domination over wisdom, you might get a darker ending. You sit on a throne somewhere, having become the thing you fought against. If you chose differently, showed restraint, built alliances instead of demanding submission, you get a hopeful ending. You help rebuild, guide rather than rule, and maybe fade into legend like the Nerevarine or the Champion of Cyrodiil. The DLCs would obviously be different in this version. Dragonborn would need to be completely reworked or cut entirely, since Mirok fills basically the same role that Uriel does in the main story. You can't have two ancient Dragonborn returning from exile plots in the same game, so maybe Dragonborn becomes something else entirely, or maybe it's replaced with a different DLC concept. Dawnguard could stay mostly the same, since it's about vampires, and that's not really connected to the main plot. Though maybe you could add some tie-ins where the vampires react to Uriel's return, or where Serana knows something about Psyche immortality magic that helps you understand what was done to Uriel. There could be a DLC specifically about Akavir, not going there directly, but dealing with the aftermath of Uriel's invasion. Maybe some of his Akaviri allies came with him to Tamriel and they've established settlements. You'd explore these places, learn more about Tseschi culture, maybe even meet some who don't agree with Uriel's crusade and want to stop him. That would expand the lore without breaking the Keep Akavir mysterious rule. Now, let's talk about the theories and speculation about where this could all go in the future, because even though Bethesda cut Uriel Septim V from Skyrim, he's still out there in the lore. He still died in Akavir, or at least that's the official story, and Akavir is still this massive mystery hanging over the Elder Scrolls universe. So, naturally, fans have been theorizing like crazy about whether we might see him again, especially with the Elder Scrolls 6 on the horizon. First, let's talk about what we actually know, which isn't much. The Elder Scrolls 6 is confirmed to be in development. Bethesda released exactly one teaser back in 2018, a brief cinematic flyover of some coastline with mountains and then the title card. That's literally it. No release date, no gameplay footage, no details about the setting beyond that one landscape shot, and that landscape has been analyzed to death by fans trying to figure out where the game takes place. The popular theories are that it's either Hammerfell or High Rock, or possibly both, since they're right next to each other. The landscape in the teaser shows coastline, mountains, and what looks like a bay or inlet. People have compared it to lore maps, matched up rock formations, argued about vegetation patterns. Some are convinced it's the Iliac Bay region where Daggerfall took place. Others think it's the western coast of Hammerfell looking out toward Yokuda. But here's where it gets interesting for our discussion. Some fans don't think that coastline matches Hammerfell or High Rock at all. They think it could be Akavir. Now, this is probably wishful thinking more than solid evidence, but the arguments are kind of compelling. The landscape in the teaser has this exotic quality to it, this sense of being somewhere alien. The way the mountains rise, the color of the water, the atmosphere. It doesn't quite match what we've seen of Tamriel's geography in previous games. If the Elder Scrolls 6 is set in Akavir, or even if it just involves Akavir in a major way, then suddenly Uriel Septim V becomes incredibly relevant. Because he's the only major Tamrielic figure we know of who actually went there and never came back. His story is intrinsically tied to Akavir. If Bethesda is finally ready to show us Akavir, they'd almost certainly have to address what happened to him. And there's precedent for Elder Scrolls games bringing back historical figures. Morrowind's whole plot is about the Nerevarine, who's the reincarnation of Indoril Nerevar from thousands of years ago. Skyrim itself has you dealing with ancient dragons and Alduin, who've been gone for millennia. The series loves digging into history and making the past directly relevant to the present. So, theory number 1. Uriel Septim V never actually died at Ionith. Maybe he was captured by the Tsaiski instead of killed. Maybe he's been their prisoner for 400 years, held in some Tsaishi fortress or palace. The Tsaiski are immortal, or at least extremely long-lived, so keeping a prisoner for centuries wouldn't be a big deal to them. What would they want with a captured Dragonborn Emperor? Information, for one thing. Uriel would know everything about the Empire, its military tactics, its weaknesses, its internal politics. The Tsaiski invaded Tamriel way back in the First Era, and they might want to do it again. Having Uriel as a source of intelligence would be incredibly valuable. Or maybe they're studying him. The Tsaiski are described as having eaten all the dragons in Akavir, which might mean they absorb dragon knowledge and power. A Dragonborn would be fascinating to them, someone who has dragon blood but in human form. They might be experimenting on him, trying to understand what makes him tick, maybe trying to steal his power for themselves. The really dark version of this theory is that Uriel made a deal. When he was dying on that battlefield, surrounded by Tsaishi, maybe they offered him a choice. Die with his failed invasion, or live and serve them. And desperate, not wanting his life's work to end in failure, he accepted. He spent 400 years as a servant or ally of the Tsaiski, and now they're finally ready to use him in their own invasion of Tamriel. That would make him tragic and terrifying at the same time. He's not just some undead monster. He's a man who made a terrible choice in a moment of weakness and has been paying for it ever since. But he's also genuinely working with the Tsaiski now, helping them conquer the empire he once ruled. That moral complexity would be perfect for an Elder Scrolls villain. Theory number 2. He did die at Ionith, but something brought him back. This is basically the original scrapped Skyrim concept. Maybe it was Daedric intervention. The Daedric princes love meddling in Tamriel's affairs, and they've been known to preserve or resurrect mortals who serve their purposes. Hermaius Mora is the obvious candidate. He's the Daedric Prince of Knowledge, of forbidden secrets and hidden truths. He collects servants who seek knowledge they shouldn't have, traps them in his realm of Apocrypha. That's exactly what happened to Mirak in the Dragonborn DLC. What if Uriel, facing death, called out for help and Mora answered? What if Mora has had Uriel stashed in Apocrypha for 4 centuries, just like Mirak, and now for whatever reason, he's releasing him? Mora loves pitting his champions against each other. He had Mirak, then you came along as the last Dragonborn, and Mora seemed really interested in you. Maybe in the Elder Scrolls 6, Mora's game is releasing Uriel to see what happens. Does Uriel succeed in reconquering the Empire? Does someone rise to stop him? Either way, Mora gets to observe and learn. Or maybe it's Molag Bal. He's the Daedric Prince of domination, of corruption, of turning good people into monsters. He created the first vampire, and vampires are all about immortality through corruption. What if Molag Bal found Uriel dying in Akavir and offered him the same deal he offered the first vampire? Eternal life and power, but you become something monstrous. An undead vampire Dragonborn Emperor would be properly horrifying. The Tsaishi are already described as vampiric, so there might be a connection there. Maybe Molag Bal has influence in Akavir, maybe the Tsaishi serve him in some way. Uriel becoming a vampire to survive would explain how he's lasted 400 years and why he's come back so twisted. Mehrunes Dagon is another option. He's all about destruction, change, revolution. The mythic Dawn cultists in Oblivion worshipped him and tried to bring him into Tamriel to destroy the Empire. What if there's a new Dagon cult, and they've somehow resurrected Uriel to be their champion? A Dragonborn Emperor leading a Daedric invasion would flip the whole dynamic of the Empire on its head. Theory number 3. It's not actually Uriel Septim V at all. It's someone or something pretending to be him. Maybe it's a Tsaiski shapeshifter who absorbed his identity somehow. The Tsaishi supposedly ate all the humans in Akavir, and if that's literal, maybe they can take the form of those they consume. A Tsashi could have eaten Uriel and gained his memories, his appearance, maybe even his dragon blood. That would let Bethesda use the concept without dealing with all the complications of resurrection. You'd have this figure claiming to be the lost emperor, acting like him, having his memories and skills. But the truth is more sinister. It's a Tsashi invasion force wearing Uriel's face as a mask, using the legitimacy of the Septim name to divide and conquer Tamriel. Or maybe it's a dragon. Dragons can be clever and manipulative, not just mindless beasts. What if a dragon found Uriel's dying body, absorbed his soul the way you absorb dragon souls in Skyrim? And now that dragon can take human form, can access Uriel's memories, can pass itself off as the Emperor, it would have Uriel's knowledge and the full power of a dragon. That's a nightmare scenario. This theory has an advantage from a storytelling perspective. Uriel Septim, the Fifth, gets to remain dead. His tragedy remains complete, but you still get to explore what he represented and what people think about him. The false Uriel's whole power comes from the legend of the real one. People follow him because they believe he's legitimate, because the Septim name still means something 400 years later. Then there's a whole separate angle involving the Nerevarine. If you played Morrowind, you know that the protagonist of that game, the Nerevarine, leaves Tamriel at the end. There are references in Oblivion and Skyrim saying the Nerevarine went to Akavir and was never heard from again. That's canon. So somewhere in Akavir, the Nerevarine is wandering around, possibly still alive because they're immune to disease and aging. What if the Elder Scrolls 6 involves finding the Nerevarine? What if they've been investigating what happened to Uriel Septim the Fifth all this time? Maybe the Nerevarine knows the truth, has seen evidence of whether he's alive or dead, has witnessed what the Tsashi did to him. That would be an incredible way to bring back one of the series' legendary protagonists while also resolving the mystery of Uriel. The Nerevarine would be old by this point, at least in terms of years lived. They left for Akavir sometime in the Third Era, and we're now in the Fourth Era, possibly 200 years after Skyrim. But they're immortal, so age doesn't mean anything to them. They've had centuries to explore Akavir, learn its secrets, maybe even integrate into its societies. They'd be the perfect guide for a new protagonist trying to understand what happened. Imagine a quest where you're searching for the Nerevarine based on fragmented reports and legends. People say there's this immortal outlander wandering Akavir, someone who's neither Tseshi nor Kapotun nor any known race. You track them down, and when you finally meet them, they've been changed by their time in Akavir. Not corrupted exactly, but different. They've seen things no one from Tamriel should see, learned truths that can't be unlearned. And they tell you about Uriel. Maybe they were there when he died, witnessed his final battle, or maybe they found evidence that he didn't die, that something else happened. They could point you toward the truth, give you the information you need to deal with whatever Uriel has become. That would tie together multiple games worth of lore in a really satisfying way. There's also the theory about a potential dragon break. Dragon breaks are this weird concept in Elder Scrolls lore where time fractures and multiple contradictory things can be simultaneously true. The most famous example is the warp in the west from Daggerfall, where 6 different endings all happened at the same time and somehow reality just dealt with it. What if there's a dragon break involving Uriel Septim the Fifth? In one timeline, he died at Ionith like the histories say. In another timeline, he survived and conquered parts of Akavir. In yet another timeline, he was captured and transformed by the Tsayaski. And now all those timelines are colliding, merging, and multiple versions of what happened are all becoming real at once. That would explain conflicting reports and evidence. Some people remember Uriel dying. Some people have proof he survived. Some people have encountered creatures that claim to be him. All of them are right because a dragon break made all possibilities real. Dealing with that would require understanding dragon break metaphysics, maybe even causing or ending one yourself. This is probably too complicated for a main plot, but it could work as a side quest or DLC concept. The implications of a dragon break are always massive, affecting not just one person, but potentially the entire timeline. If Uriel's fate is bound up in a dragon break, then figuring out what happened to him might mean reshaping history itself. Now, here's the thing about all these theories. They require Bethesda to actually engage with Akavir in some meaningful way, and Todd Howard has been really clear about wanting to keep Akavir mysterious. That's literally why they cut the Uriel plot from Skyrim. He said, keep the mysterious lands mysterious, and that philosophy has guided the series for decades. Akavir has been this distant legendary place since Arena. Every game has referenced it, built it up as exotic and dangerous and unknowable. The moment Bethesda actually shows it to us, actually takes us there and explains what it is, some of that mystique evaporates. So maybe The Elder Scrolls 6 won't go to Akavir at all. Maybe it stays in the familiar parts of Tamriel, and Akavir remains just out of reach. But even if we don't go to Akavir directly, Uriel Septim V could still be relevant. Think about how Skyrim handled Akavir influence without ever taking us there. Skyhaven Temple with its Akaviri architecture, Alduin's wall covered in Akaviri art, the blades and their Akaviri heritage. You could feel Akaviri's presence throughout the game without seeing it. The Elder Scrolls 6 could do the same thing but more focused on Uriel's story. Maybe you find Akaviri refugees in Hammerfell or High Rock, descendants of survivors from the disaster at Ionet. They'd have their own culture now, a blend of Tamrielic and Akaviri elements, and they'd carry stories about what happened to the Emperor who led their ancestors to their doom. Imagine a whole settlement of people whose great-great-grandparents were part of Uriel's invasion. They've preserved imperial military traditions, mixed with things they learned from the Tsaeski. They have artifacts from the campaign, journals, and letters written by soldiers who died at Ionet. They might even have a shrine to Uriel, honoring him as a fallen hero or warning about the dangers of overreaching ambition. You could have a quest line about helping them recover more information about their history. Maybe they want to send an expedition back to Akavir to find out what really happened, to retrieve the bodies of their ancestors, or discover if anyone survived. You'd help them prepare, gather resources, and maybe you'd even go with them on a small mission to Akaviri waters without actually landing on the continent itself. That would let Bethesda touch on Akavir without fully committing to showing it. You'd get close, you'd see it on the horizon, maybe visit a small island off its coast. But the main continent remains mysterious. It's threading the needle between fan demands to see Akavir and Todd Howard's philosophy of keeping it mysterious. There's also the political angle that doesn't require Uriel to be alive. His legend alone could be powerful enough to cause problems. The Empire in the Fourth Era is weak, as we saw in Skyrim. The Septim line ended, the Medes took over, but they lack legitimacy. The Talmor are winning the war, provinces are breaking away. It's a slow collapse. In times like these, people look to the past for hope. They remember when the Empire was strong, when Dragonborn emperors ruled, when Tamriel was united and powerful. Uriel Septim V represents that golden age, the last emperor who showed real strength and ambition before everything fell apart. His memory becomes this rallying point for people who want the old empire back. You could have political movements or cults forming around the idea of Uriel. Maybe there's a group called the Septim Loyalists who believe the empire needs a true Septim heir to restore it. They're searching for any surviving descendants of the Septim bloodline, or they're trying to find evidence that Uriel somehow survived. They're not necessarily wrong or evil, they're just desperate for something to believe in. Then you could have someone claiming to be Uriel or claiming to be his heir, a pretender to the throne, basically. This happens all the time in real history when dynasties fall apart. People show up claiming to be lost princes or the secret child of the true king. Sometimes they're deliberate frauds, sometimes they genuinely believe it, sometimes the truth is ambiguous. Imagine a charismatic figure appears in Hammerfell or High Rock claiming to be Uriel Septim V, preserved by Tsaeski magic, returned to restore the empire. They have some evidence, some artifacts that might be authentic. They can speak Akaviri languages, they know things about the invasion that only someone who was there would know. They might even have dragon blood, able to wear Septim relics or speak some words of Tuum. Are they really Uriel? Are they a fraud who studied history carefully? Are they a Tsashi spy wearing a stolen identity? Part of the game would be figuring that out. And meanwhile, this person is gathering followers, raising armies, threatening to start a new war, to reclaim the Ruby Throne. Even if they're fake, the chaos they cause is real. That would let Bethesda explore the themes and story beats of Uriel's return without committing to him actually being alive. The legend is powerful enough on its own. People believe in it enough to follow it. Whether the person wearing his name is real or fake almost doesn't matter politically. The symbol has power. You'd have to decide what to do about this pretender. Support them and help them rally support, potentially restoring something like the old empire. Expose them as a fraud and deal with the fallout of destroying people's hope. Try to use them for your own purposes. Or maybe discover they actually are Uriel and then figure out if that's a good thing or not. This kind of plot would be perfect for the Elder Scrolls 6 if it's set in Hammerfell and High Rock, the Iliac Bay region. That area has always been politically complicated, with lots of small kingdoms and city-states competing for power. Someone claiming to be a Septim Emperor showing up would throw the whole region into chaos. Some states would support him, others would oppose, others would try to play both sides. The Talmor would definitely get involved. The Aldmeri Dominion wants to keep the empire weak and divided. Someone trying to restore the Septim dynasty would be a major threat to their plans. You'd probably have Talmor agents working to undermine the pretender, spreading doubt, maybe even trying to assassinate them. That adds another layer of intrigue and danger. There's also speculation about how the Elder Scrolls 6 main plot might connect to previous games. Bethesda likes to build on what came before while telling new stories. Skyrim was about the return of dragons and dealt with the aftermath of Oblivion's ending. The Elder Scrolls 6 needs to do something similar, acknowledging what happened in Skyrim while pushing the story forward. Dragons are still in the world as of Skyrim's end. Paarthurnax survived, Odahviin can be summoned, Durnevier is hanging around. The Dragonborn, the player character from Skyrim, is also presumably still alive somewhere, unless they died in the interim. So the world state includes dragons and at least one powerful Dragonborn. If Uriel Septim V shows up in the Elder Scrolls 6, the game would need to address this. Where's the last Dragonborn? Why aren't they dealing with this other Dragonborn? Maybe they died fighting some threat we never saw. Maybe they left Tamriel like the Nerevarine did. Maybe they became a hermit like the Greybeards. Or maybe they're around but old or weakened or bound by some obligation that prevents them from acting. Alternatively, maybe the last Dragonborn is active and you interact with them. They could be an NPC quest giver who recognizes that Uriel's return or this pretender claiming to be him is a problem that needs solving. They can't handle it alone because they're dealing with other threats, so they recruit you to investigate. That would be a cool way to include the previous protagonist without making them overshadow the new player character. Some fans think Bethesda is setting up Akavir as the location for a spin-off game rather than a main numbered entry. The Elder Scrolls 6 might stay in Tamriel, but then there could be something like The Elder Scrolls Adventures, Akavir, or The Elder Scrolls Legends, The Disaster at Ionith. A more focused, maybe more linear game specifically about Uriel's invasion. You could play as one of the Imperial soldiers in Uriel's legions, experiencing the whole campaign from the landing at Septimia to the final battle. You'd see the initial optimism, the growing dread as things go wrong, the horror of the siege and the desperate breakout. You'd witness Uriel's death, or witness whatever really happened to him. It would be like a historical drama, showing a piece of Elder Scrolls history that's been referenced but never seen. That would let Bethesda finally show Akavir without committing to it as an open-world sandbox setting. A more structured narrative game can control what you see and what remains mysterious. You'd experience Akavir through the limited perspective of an invading soldier who doesn't understand what's happening. The Tsaishi remain alien and frightening because you never fully comprehend them. This is probably wishful thinking though. Bethesda hasn't done a spin-off Elder Scrolls game in decades. They're focused on main entries and online content for Elder Scrolls Online. But it would be a cool way to explore this part of the lore without breaking their rule about keeping Akavir mysterious in the main series. Speaking of Elder Scrolls Online, that game has been gradually expanding what we know about the Second Era and filling in historical gaps. They've added content about the Akaviri Potentate, shown more Akaviri architecture and artifacts, explored how Akaviri refugees integrated into Tamriel. ESO is doing the groundwork, planting seeds that could be harvested in later games. If Bethesda does decide to bring Uriel back in The Elder Scrolls 6, ESO might start dropping hints and foreshadowing. Maybe they'll add a storyline about expeditions to Akavir, or about Seishi agents operating in Tamriel, or about cults trying to resurrect dead emperors. ESO is a good place to test ideas and see how the community reacts before committing to them in a main game. There's also the practical development angle to consider. The Elder Scrolls 6 has been in development for years now, possibly since before Skyrim's development cycle ended. Bethesda announced it way back in 2018, which means they'd been working on it for a while before that announcement. We're looking at potentially 15 years between Skyrim and The Elder Scrolls 6. That's a massive gap, and fans are expecting something equally massive in return. The hype and expectations are enormous. People want The Elder Scrolls 6 to be the biggest, most ambitious game Bethesda has ever made. Going to Akavir, or bringing back a cut concept from Skyrim that fans have been discussing for over a decade, would be a huge statement. It would show that Bethesda listens to the community and is willing to finally pay off storylines they've been building for years. On the other hand, maybe that's exactly why they won't do it. The expectations might be too high to meet. Akavir has been built up as this exotic, mysterious, dangerous place for over 20 years. No matter what Bethesda actually shows us, it's not going to match what fans have imagined. The reality will inevitably disappoint someone. And Uriel Septim, the Fifth as a concept, has been analyzed and theorized about so much that whatever Bethesda actually does with him might feel derivative or predictable. The community has come up with so many versions of how he could return, what his motivations would be, how the plot would unfold. It's hard to surprise people at this point. This is the curse of cut content becoming public knowledge. Once people know about it, they start wishing for it, building it up in their heads as this perfect thing that could have been. The actual version that was being developed, if it had made it into Skyrim, might have been kind of rough or poorly written or just not that interesting, but because we never saw it, we can imagine it as perfect. Bethesda knows this. They know that bringing back Uriel now would invite immediate comparisons to the scrapped Skyrim concept and to over a decade of fan theories. Whatever they do would be judged against all of that, which is a nearly impossible standard to meet. So maybe it's safer to just let him remain dead, let Akavir remain mysterious, and tell new stories that aren't burdened by all this baggage. But man, even acknowledging all that, it's still exciting to speculate. Because Uriel Septim V is such a perfect example of unrealized potential in gaming. He's this fascinating historical figure with a tragic story, perfect setup for a return, thematic richness about legacy and power and corruption, and Bethesda came so close to using him as Skyrim's villain. They did the design work, thought through how it would play, and then changed course. That alternate timeline where they stuck with the original plan haunts Elder Scrolls fans. We'll never get to play that version of Skyrim. We'll never know exactly what Bethesda had planned, how the quests would have unfolded, what Uriel would have been like as a character. It's gone, replaced by what we got, which is great in its own way, but fundamentally different. And maybe that's okay. Maybe part of the magic is not knowing, leaving room for imagination and speculation. The Elder Scrolls has always been good at leaving mysteries unsolved, at giving players just enough information to form theories, but not so much that everything's explained. Uriel Septim V fits perfectly into that tradition. We know he existed, we know what he did, we know how he supposedly died, but we don't know if that's really the end of his story. Whether Bethesda brings him back in The Elder Scrolls 6, or in some other game, or never brings him back at all, he's already secured his place in Elder Scrolls mythology. He's the emperor who tried to conquer the unconquerable and vanished in the attempt. He's the road not taken in Skyrim's development. He's the question mark hanging over Akavir and the future of the series. And for fans who love digging into lore, who love speculating about connections and possibilities, who love imagining what could be, Uriel Septim V is basically perfect. He's a mystery that might never be solved, a story that might never be finished, and that's what keeps people talking about him over a decade after Skyrim came out. So whether we ever see Uriel Septim V in an Elder Scrolls game or not, whether Bethesda decides to finally explore his fate or keep him ambiguous forever, he's already won in a sense. He's become one of those characters that transcends the actual text of the games, that lives in the space between what's said and what's left unsaid. And in a series all about ancient mysteries and histories that echo through time, that's maybe the most Elder Scrolls thing possible. The visible lore, the stuff written in books and spoken by NPCs, that's just the surface. Underneath, there's this whole web of development history, cut content, abandoned ideas, roads not taken. Uriel Septim V exists in that web. He's part of the Elder Scrolls universe's shadow, the things that almost were, the stories that were started but not finished. And that's honestly kind of beautiful. It means the series isn't fixed, isn't predetermined. Every game is the result of hundreds of decisions, any one of which could have gone differently. Skyrim, with Uriel as the villain, would have been a completely different experience. Different themes, different emotional beats, different moments that players would remember. We got the version we got, and it's one of the best games ever made. But that alternate version is out there, somewhere in the space of creative possibility. And as long as Bethesda keeps making Elder Scrolls games, as long as the series continues, that possibility remains. Maybe in 10 years we'll be playing the Elder Scrolls 6 and there'll be a quest about Akaviri ruins, or a book about the disaster at Ionit, or an NPC who claims to have seen the ghost of a long-dead emperor. Or maybe we won't. Maybe Uriel stays dead and Akavir stays mysterious and new stories take center stage. Either way, the speculation, the theories, the what-ifs, those will continue. Because that's what Elder Scrolls fans do. We obsess over the details. We connect dots that might not actually connect. We build elaborate theories about things that might never have been intended as mysteries. And Bethesda knows this about their fan base. They know we'll analyze every word, every environmental detail, every piece of lore. They've built a series that rewards that kind of engagement, that has enough depth and ambiguity to support endless discussion and interpretation. Uriel Septim V is a perfect example of how that works. His story is both complete and unfinished, both clear and ambiguous, both historical fact and open question. So thanks for sticking with this deep dive into one of Elder Scrolls' most fascinating characters and one of gaming's great what-ifs. Whether you're falling asleep to this or working through some task, I hope you learned something new about Skyrim's development, about the lore behind Uriel Septim V, about what might have been and what might still be. The Elder Scrolls series has always been about this sense of depth, of hidden histories and ancient mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Every game adds more lore, more questions, more connections to discover. And the development history, the behind-the-scenes decisions about what to include and what to cut, that's another layer of depth that most games don't have. Uriel Septim V embodies all of that. He's a character from the lore who almost became central to Skyrim's plot. He's a historical figure whose fate remains ambiguous. He's a potential threat who might appear in future games or might stay dead forever. He's a symbol of imperial ambition and overreach, of what happens when great men reach too far, of how legends can outlive the people who inspired them. And he's a reminder that game development is this messy, complicated, creative process where great ideas sometimes get left behind. Not because they're bad, but because they don't fit, or because the timing isn't right, or because something else works better. The version of Skyrim that had Uriel as the villain might have been amazing, or it might have been a disaster. We'll never know. What we do know is that Skyrim, as it exists, is incredible, and some of that comes from the work that went into concepts like the Uriel plot, even though they didn't make it to the final game. The Akaviri influence throughout the main quest, the Dragonborn DLC's exploration of two Dragonborn fighting, the political complexity of the Civil War, All of that has roots in that original concept. So, Uriel Septim V didn't make it into Skyrim, but his ghost is there if you know where to look. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the stories we almost got are just as important as the ones we did get, because they shaped the creative process, influenced the final product, gave us something to wonder about and discuss and theorize over. Until The Elder Scrolls 6 finally comes out, probably in several more years, we'll keep speculating, we'll keep looking for hints and clues. We'll keep hoping that maybe, just maybe, Bethesda will finally give us answers about Akavir and Uriel and all these mysteries they've been building for decades. And even if they don't, even if those mysteries stay mysteries forever, we'll keep talking about them. Because that's the mark of great world building. It creates questions that fans want answered, histories that feel real enough to investigate, possibilities that spark imagination. Uriel Septim V, the emperor who vanished in the east, the villain who never was, the legend that might come true, he's all of that. And whether we ever see him again or not, he's already earned his place in the Elder Scrolls pantheon of fascinating characters. So keep your eyes on the horizon, watch for news about the Elder Scrolls 6, pay attention to what gets revealed about the setting, the plot, the themes. And if you see any hint, any suggestion, any possibility that Akavir might be involved, or that Uriel might appear, then get ready. Because if Bethesda finally decides to tell that story, it's going to be something special. And if they don't, well, we'll still have these theories, these discussions, these what-ifs to keep us occupied until the next game comes along. The Elder Scrolls is at its best when it makes us think, when it gives us enough to work with, but not so much that there is no room for interpretation. Uriel Septim V is that philosophy perfectly embodied. We know enough to be fascinated. We don't know enough to be satisfied. And that tension, that space between knowledge and mystery, that's where the magic happens. That's where fans live, in that space, exploring and theorizing and imagining. And that's exactly where Uriel Septim V belongs, in that space between what was and what might yet be.